Dear Patriots, before the news starts, please subscribe to our patriotic channel by clicking the subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up to this video. Don't forget to leave your opinion below in the comments section. Share the news on Facebook and Twitter so you friends see it. Thank you.
Trump tells Senate GOP to go nuclear. President Donald Trump began the second day of the government shutdown imploring Senate Republicans to invoke the so-called nuclear option, having the chamber vote on all legislation on a majority basis. If stalemate continues, Republicans should go to 51%, nuclear option, and vote on real, long-term budget, no CRs, the president wrote on Twitter shortly after 7:30 a.m. In the past, key GOP senators, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, RK, have rebuffed the president, telling him that going nuclear and ending the legislative filibuster could be a damaging move in the long term. If Republicans lost control of the chamber, a 51-vote threshold for legislation could potentially make it easier for more liberal priorities, such as universal health care, to pass the Senate. A spokesman for McConnell said Sunday, the Republican conference opposes changing the rules on legislation. It is not even clear whether Republicans could muster 51 votes by themselves. On Friday, 4 Republicans and McConnell voted against allowing the House-passed continuing resolution to move forward. For procedural reasons, McConnell had to vote against the proposal in order to bring it up later. In recent years, both parties have curtailed the filibuster, which, when invoked, requires 60 votes to pass legislation. The filibuster was designed to differentiate the Senate from the House by ensuring that the majority could not steamroll the minority. In 2013, then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, Democrat Nevada, pushed his colleagues to require 51 votes for all presidential and judicial nominees below the Supreme Court. After it became clear that Neil Gorsuch would not receive 60 votes last year, McConnell pushed and succeeded in ending the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, paving the way for Gorsuch's confirmation. Trump also continued his shutdown assault on Democrats by arguing that the party just wants illegal immigrants to pour into the country. One of the sticking points of the government shutdown is the future of so-called dreamers, but the president himself has said that he loves these people. The Senate is adjourned until 1 p.m. Sunday. McConnell vowed Saturday night to hold another vote on reopening the government on Monday at 1 a.m. The House is adjourned until 2 p.m. Dreamers dragged through the mud. For much of his presidency, Donald Trump promised he'd treat dreamers with heart, showing an unusual level of sympathy for someone whose hardline immigration stance was the hallmark of his campaign. "I have a love for these people," Trump said in September. But now, dreamers are getting dragged into the toxic politics of the government shutdown. Republicans are sharpening their rhetoric against the dreamers, pitting them against other popular priorities such as keeping the children's health care program solvent and funding the military. Trump's political arm released an ad accusing top Democrats of siding with the interests of illegal immigrants over Americans, a point top White House officials, including the president himself, made throughout the first day of the shutdown. "Democrats are far more concerned with illegal immigrants than they are with our great military or safety at our dangerous southern border," Trump tweeted on Saturday. "We will not negotiate the status of 690,000 unlawful immigrants while hundreds of millions of tax-paying Americans, including hundreds of thousands of our troops in uniform and border agents protecting our country, are held hostage by Senate Democrats," added White House Legislative Director Mark Short, "though those dreamers can work legally and they, too, pay taxes." The increasingly heated rhetoric, not to mention the general morass of shutdown politics, is prompting some people concerned with the plight of dreamers to privately question whether this battle will ultimately hurt the cause of winning them permanent protection from deportation. Senator Jeff Flake, Republican Arizona, a veteran of the immigration wars who favors comprehensive reform, was also surprised that the cause of dreamers had prompted such a partisan battle. Flake and Senator Lindsey Graham, RSC, spent much of Saturday cloistered with Senate leaders and other rank-and-file senators, trying to carve out a path not only to reopen the government but also somehow to move a deal to enshrine the Deferred Action for Child Arrivals Program, or DACA. Flake recalled that in previous immigration negotiations, finding legal status for Dreamers was always the easier part of the discussions, and that piece was used to help move other, more controversial changes to immigration laws. This is a sympathetic group. We knew it could move on its own, Flake said. Now on its own, it's the reason we're shutting down the government. Senate Minority Whip Dick Durbin, DO, the top negotiator on immigration for Senate Democrats, said that for now, he wasn't concerned that the ugly shutdown battle would end up hurting the prospects of a bipartisan immigration deal. But the sooner we get beyond this, the better, Durbin added. The longer it goes, the worse it gets. There are tangible consequences of a protracted shutdown when it comes to negotiations. For one, the White House has flatly refused to negotiate on immigration while the federal government's doors are closed. The primary team tapped with brokering an immigration deal, the number 2 leaders in each chamber, along with top administration officials, hasn't met since a Friday morning session that the Democratic whips did not attend. At that Friday meeting, Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn, Republican Texas, stressed that there would be no reason for the leaders to continue the discussion as long as Democrats threatened to reject bills that would stave off a government shutdown, according to a source familiar with the conversation. Now that they have, I don't expect it to get rescheduled until they reopen the government, the person said. It's baffling to many on Capitol Hill that a broadly popular initiative such as protecting Dreamers could trigger a shutdown. A CNN poll released Friday showed the DACA program is almost universally popular. 84% of those surveyed said they would like to see it continue. It's clear to me the Democratic Party's willing to do something on DACA. What's equally clear to me is that an overwhelming number of Republicans will be fair to the DACA population, said Graham. Which just blows my mind. As Mitch, McConnell, said, how could this happen? How could you take an 80% issue and screw it up? The popularity of the DACA program, however, changes when tied to the shutdown. The CNN poll also found that 56% of voters said averting a shutdown was more important than continuing the DACA program, while 34% favored DACA. Democrats and advocates were dismissive of the poll's findings, arguing that it set up a false choice when both outcomes were simultaneously plausible. Some advocates believe the administration's scorched earth rhetorical campaign against Dreamers won't do much damage in the long run. Are Dreamers going to be somehow less popular? That number has gradually gone up over the last 5-10 years, one advocate said. Even if you lost 20% of Republicans, you'd lose 4 to 5% with the public. Before agreeing to any stopgap funding of more than a few days, Democrats are insisting on a path forward for an immigration deal through both chambers of Congress. Advocates say there is no path unless an immigration fix is tied to a must-pass bill like a spending measure. That's a non-starter for Republicans. But for advocates, the showdown is worth it. We were being slow-walked to death, said Frank Shari, executive director of the immigration advocacy group America's Voice. The Republican strategy, the McConnell-Paul Ryan strategy, was to isolate the DACA fix from the spending negotiations so that it would be delayed and derailed. President Carter pardons draft dodgers, January 21, 1977. On this day in 1977, President Jimmy Carter, in his first full day in office, fulfilled a campaign promise by granting unconditional pardons to hundreds of thousands of men who had evaded the draft during the Vietnam War by fleeing the country or by failing to register with their selective service boards. At the time, the blanket amnesty generated a good deal of criticism, from veterans groups and others who disapproved of the idea of letting perceived unpatriotic lawbreakers get off scot-free. On the other end of the political spectrum, the pardon came under fire from amnesty groups for not having addressed deserters, or soldiers who were dishonorably discharged or violent civilian anti-war demonstrators. Gerald Ford, Carter's predecessor in the White House, had offered conditional amnesty to some draft dodgers. Carter, however, seeking to heal the war's physical wounds, set no conditions, although, as noted above, some individuals were excluded from the pardon. In all, about 100,000 Americans went abroad in the late 1960s and early 70s to avoid being called up. Some 90% went to Canada where, after some initial controversy, they were accepted as legal immigrants. Thousands went into hiding at home, sometimes changing their identities. In addition, about 1,000 military deserters found their way to Canada. While Canadian authorities at first indicated they would be prosecuted or deported, in practice they were left alone. Canadian border guards were told not to ask too many questions. For its part, the federal government continued to prosecute draft evaders after the Vietnam War ended. A total of 209,517 men were accused of violating draft laws, while another approximately 360,000 were never formally charged. Before Carter issued his pardon, those who had fled to Canada faced prison sentences if they chose to return to the United States. In the end, an estimated 50,000 draft dodgers chose to settle permanently in Canada. As Canadian citizens, some of them have entered the political scene. Although President Richard Nixon ended the draft in 1973, desertion has remained an issue as Americans continued to fight wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. More than 20,000 soldiers have been dropped from the rolls as deserters since 2006, Army data show. In cases that were tried in military courts over the past 13 years, about half the soldiers pleaded guilty to deserting their posts. The U.S. Army has prosecuted about 1,900 cases of desertion since 2001, including Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who left his Afghanistan post in 2009 and was captured and held by the Taliban for 5 years. Last November, a military judge, Colonel Jeffrey Nance, rejected a prosecutor's recommendation that Bergdahl be sentenced to 14 years confinement. Nance ruled that he should be dishonorably discharged and reduced in rank to private. President Donald Trump criticized the decision as a disgrace to the military and said Bergdahl should be shot. Source: www.history.com